I was coming and going pretty regularly. There was a regular and continuous flow.
Yeah.
And then the next long tour that I did was the 2015 tour when I went back as the Special Purpose Marine Air Ground Task Force CENTCOM Crisis Response Operations Officer.
Wow.
That was the tour where the majority of my impression and the ideas that I was starting to feel about the war really found that the foundation of them really firmed up during that tour. That
In
was that
2015.
Yeah, that was the heartbreaker tour. That was the tour where I realized my worst fears. I think that what we were doing and what we had done had just completely derailed, and we were reinventing the wheel, and everything we'd achieved and all the momentum we had built up from 2003 to 2010 had been completely lost. The majority of all the turf that we owned and the equipment that we had left had been surrendered to ISIS or lost or destroyed. And we had, from my perspective, and it was interesting because I ended up returning to work with, in many cases, the 7th Iraqi Army, who was the same unit that I had begun my tours over there with in 2006. And they were equally incompetent at the time, which was tragic. But elsewhere, I got a more broad perspective on Iraqi military operations, especially in the fight for Ramadi against ISIS in late 2015. And, people probably didn't follow that fight and didn't really know much about it, but the fight was supposed to have taken place at a certain date. It was supposed to have been completed, the battle for Ramadi, to clear ISIS during 2015 at a certain date and time. And they ended up not being able to do that. The Iraqis couldn't clear ISIS from the city. And that fight extended multiple months. And of course, we were there advising on it all day, every day. And we were providing support and, through indirect fires and through intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, giving these guys feedback and guiding and all this stuff. And we would just watch day in, day out that the Iraqis just could not seem to manage dealing with ISIS, or as I came to believe, would not deal with ISIS. And so that was just that was gut wrenching, to be honest with you, watching it every day. And I would get reports, and this is no exaggeration, and I won't name the units, but I would get reports about how they had advanced 50 meters, and then they had withdrawn 150 meters. And I'd get out there and I'd start talking to these guys and say, "What is going on? How did you only advance 50 meters?" And we'd get a report that a sniper had the Iraqi element on the ground pinned down. And that would really make me scratch my head, because I would look at the Iraqi element that was fighting and I would say, "You have M1 Abrams tanks in the lead of your fight. How is an Iraqi sniper, or is an ISIS insurgent sniper pinning down an armored column?" And I'm not exaggerating. This was real.
Wow.
And we would just sit there and we would say, "There's no way that this is." I myself, Win Tierney's opinion, could not fathom it being anything other than either disinterest or utter incompetence or other things that were at play that I didn't know about. Um, I recollect watching Iraqi Special Operations Forces be trained. I recollect going on missions with Iraqi Special Operations Forces, known as ISOF, in the earlier years. And if ever there was an organization that I thought would have had enough continuity and would have had enough training and would have been well postured and situated to help maintain Iraqi security and deal with this problem, it was going to be them. And then we get back over there and it's gone. And when you see that ISOF had folded and was gone, or just simply wasn't being utilized correctly or managed correctly, or just wasn't really helping to contribute enough to fighting this fight, it became heartbreaking. It's just like, man, what did we do for the first 7 years that we were here? We left Iraq in 2010, because the president promised we're going to leave Iraq and the war is over. But the war wasn't over. By 2012, ISIS had reformed in Syria and exploded across the border, and had made a mad dash to in the north to the oil fields in Mosul, and then had spread out across all of the same rat lines that we dealt with all the way through Anbar in their way to Ramadi and to Fallujah and Karma and the Triad region right there. And it was so that's what took me back in 15 is our crisis response organization was really given, it wasn't crisis response anymore, it was a full-time mission. We were assigned when we got there, our mission statement, without going into the details of the classification of it, basically said you're here to deal with ISIS. And yeah, it was just stunning to me. I'm like, how did this happen? How did this, within such a short period of time? Well, it happened because we never finished the problem in the first place. And we left, in 2010. And everybody's like, yeah, but ISIS was different. ISIS wasn't different. ISIS was Zarqawi's guys, JTJ, before they were ISIS, back in the 90s and into the early 2000s. And, Zarqawi comes along and tells bin Laden, you're not fighting hard enough. I want to do more. And there's this rift between Zarqawi and bin Laden. But Zarqawi had his own team. And we killed Zarqawi, not me, but, the U.S. kills Zarqawi. The coalition kills him. And everybody's like, well, that's good. That's done. Well, his guys didn't go away. They're still out there. And it was crazy because I remember in 15, I walked into my intelligence department one day and I'm like, hey, let's talk about some targeting options and let's talk about what you guys are looking at. And I've got this map of the Western Al Anbar province up. And I said, okay, over here in Al Qaim, I want to do whatever. And over in this city, I want to do whatever. And down here near Akashat, I want to check the border and I want to do this. And I've got about 80 guys in this room. And one of the senior staff NCOs raises his hand and he looks at me. He's like, hey, sir, can I ask a question? I'm like, yeah, sure. And he goes, are you an intel officer? And I'm like, I'm your operations officer. No, I'm not the intel officer. He goes, well, how do you know all this? And I'm like, how do I know all what? And he goes, well, how do you know all these places? And how do you know that activity is going on here? And that's when it really struck me. I'm like, oh, man, not only have we lost all this turf, did we throw it all away in Iraq? We've lost the resident knowledge on this. We've got new guys who are coming up in such a short period of time since 2010. I don't know what they were doing, and no fault of their own. They don't make the determination on how they're going to serve. The military does. But the information had been lost. The knowledge had been lost. And that was one of the hardest things for me. That's, that whole 2015 tour, all these things that I've just mentioned kind of culminating. And that's where it broke my heart. I'm like, I can't even get my head around this anymore.
As I'm talking to Iraq and Afghanistan vets, I get this from Vietnam vets too, although not nearly to the same extent. And that may be because Vietnam was, decades ago, like 50 years ago, 50 plus. And so, the time may make a difference. But what really strikes me as I talk to the Iraq and Afghanistan combat guys, the guys who are in the ambushes, the guys who are dealing with the IEDs, is an intense bitterness, and I'm reluctant to use the word rage, but I think that's even there. And what I've been wondering, and I'm wondering it again as I'm listening to you, I mean, this is at least partly the stuff of combat in that kind of environment, and you and I will talk about that. But I wonder if a lot of this really intense bitterness that I've heard from Iraq and Afghanistan vets is what you're describing and what you say in your memoir. We did all this, and then we just walked away like it was magically going to be fine, and it was a complete disaster. Well, so first, I guess I'm interested in your response to what I just said, but then also, if we could roll the tape back to 2009, and someone asks you, so what should we do to make sure that this at least is a somewhat orderly situation and that Iraq can be somewhat stable? What would you do? So pick it up from there.
So to your first point about bitterness, my immediate response is absolutely. I struggle with this. I have struggled with this, and I've had extreme difficulties with this. Your allegiance and your loyalty to serving your country, and especially for me, serving as a United States Marine, something my father was back in the 50s. And I've got a brother and sister who served in the Army. They were West Point grads. And, so we have a proud military lineage in my family. My allegiance to being a Marine is unshakable. My love for the Marine Corps and my honor uh, that I feel and respect for the Marine Corps is unwavering. And then you have that in one bin, and in the other bin, you're looking at what our country asked us to do as Marines, and our brothers in the Corps, what we were asked to go out and do, and sisters in the Corps, were asked to go out and do. And I find that the proud and honorable organization that I gave 28 years of my life to is thrust into something that I struggle with for many of the things that we've already discussed. Lack of good guidance, lack of direction, lack of vision, lack of strategy, lack of leadership. And so what you have is this clash of your the pride you have in this ultimate thing, the Marine Corps, and then watching what it was used for. There are fights that mattered. World War II was a fight that mattered. It was for a continental security of peoples who faced extermination, and some particular people groups that faced, mass extermination in the most horrifying methods. If the world didn't get involved in World War II, the face of the globe would have been reshaped, and not only in Europe, but as we know with the Japanese and their intent to deal with Far Asia and probably us on our home turf. That was a fight that mattered. There was no avoiding that. And no matter what happened there, there was a clear end state that this was for the peace and security of the entire planet. You look at a dumpster fire like Iraq, and I can't make that justification. And so then I look at it and I think, I felt, and who am I to feel this way? I'm nobody. I'm just another guy. And I don't speak for the Marine Corps. And I'm sure there are thousands of Marines who would say, well, Tierney, you're all wrong. Okay. But I felt that it was almost a black mark for us to be involved in this thing. Because we didn't complete the task the way it should have been completed. We weren't allowed to fight the fight in many capacities the way I thought we needed to fight it. I felt like we were being hamstrung. I felt like we were being held back. And so then you're like, man, we're the baddest fighting force ever to exist in human history. I firmly believe that. I would take that challenge against anybody. And we're not even being allowed to do our job the way we should. And we leave these disasters unfinished. And I can go into all the different, how many people did we kill? How many people of ours got killed? The thousands of people, how many families were ruined because of this? And at the end of it, you're scratching your head saying, okay, what did we gain?
Mhm.
What changed for the United States? If the price of gas had dropped down to 2 cents a gallon across the entire United States, well, you could say, man, that's a really crappy reason to go to war. And you killed lots of people, and you ruined a country, and heck, you put a dent in an entire region of the planet, the Middle East, as a result of this, all for your gas. But at least you got something out of it. But we didn't even get that. Nothing changed. And I love when I hear people say, well, history hasn't been written yet. Well, all right. I mean, maybe, or maybe that's just a cop out because you don't have an answer for why we
Well,
did this and what we're going to get.
yeah. Well, I mean, I don't, it's not hard for me to imagine somebody writing a history book pulling April 1975 and then the end of Iraq and the end of Afghanistan. So, South Vietnam collapses. Because some of what you're saying reminds me of things I've heard from Vietnam vets. We walked away.
Yeah.
South Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. It's not hard for me to imagine someone 20 years from now saying, look, you know, we can take these three events, put them together, find common themes, and that's a major story of the late 20th, early 21st century.
I absolutely believe you could do that. So you asked, where does the bitterness come from? It starts with me as a feeling of I wasn't utilized the way I thought I was supposed to. Now you could say, well, you were naive, and maybe I was. And then you could also say you're a military man. You're sworn to an oath, and you really don't have a say. Maybe I didn't. I do now. Do I have a right to? No more than anybody else, but no less than anybody else either. And so my answer to that is I just couldn't take it anymore, and I opened my mouth. I had a guy that I've known my whole entire career. It kind of took me by surprise. He says, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not feeling relevant anymore. I began to think and ponder where he was going with that. And, and it kind of plays into, we spend our entire careers, guys like him and guys like me, training for the Super Bowl. And yeah, did we ever really think we were going to end up in a war? I never really probably thought when I was a young Marine that I was actually going to end up in a war. But then one starts, and we train hard for the Super Bowl, and we go to the Super Bowl, and we go again and again and again and again. And then it's over, and you look at it and you're like, yeah, but that was a crappy game. Nobody watched, nobody cared, and it doesn't mean anything, and nothing changed. And you realize, like, man, I trained for something. We went over there and we did all that stuff. To what end? And now you kind of just come away with it like, well, now what? Is that what my life was? Is that? And I think a lot of guys get frustrated by that because they can't see a tangible result in what they did. You know, if they walked away and they saw some form, I don't know, democracy is the wrong thing for the Middle East, right? It's not going to, the wrong thing to see. But if we had seen something that seemingly positively influenced this part of the world, wherein many of the struggles and challenges that everybody else is having are diminishing or going away, then we might say, well, all right, we made it better than we left it better than we when we started. I don't see that right now.
If we could roll the tape back to 2009, what do you think might have made a difference over the next several years?
I think that leaving entirely would, which was the premise until we had to go back with ISIS, wasn't going to work. So we have this sort of in the Marine Corps we call them unit deployment program to Okinawa, Japan, where you deploy to Okinawa and you're there for 6 months and you rotate back to the States. And we always have a unit doing that. And we've got some sort of limited headquarters in Oki, and we've been doing that since World War II, right? Um, I would have foreseen a program like that where we would have had a more continuous and consistent presence as we began to dial it down, and it would have taken many many years, I'm sure. And the strategy and the operation and how we went about dealing with that reduction of force over time would drive how we dealt with the enemy on the ground or whatever. But it also would have I think we would have had to have, and this is out of my lane, but I'm not sure the political approach to how we managed this was correct either. And I don't think I can talk intelligently enough about that, other than to say that from our perspective, as action officer guys, we were kind of looking up like, man, we just keep getting this wrong with the political leadership that we're trying to install in this place. And the decisions that need to be made that aren't being made, like, what to do with the three major groups in Iraq. At one point, there was a discussion of should it be three different countries? You got the Kurds in the north, the Shia and the Sunnis. Well, I don't know. But I feel like that stuff wasn't dealt with well enough. And then I feel like our withdrawal was very, very rapid, and we didn't leave sort of a contingency force on the ground to really work through transitional challenges. And so you got a skeleton crew there. ISIS is empowered over in Syria, and and finally they break loose, and there's nobody there to stop them. And I think the argument probably from leaders at the senior level would have been, well, you train the Iraqis to do that. Really? And I would ask those senior leaders, I don't know how often you got out there or what kind of dog and pony show you were shown, but I wouldn't have trusted most of those guys in 2010 to lead a march to the men's room, for goodness sakes. They were just not competent and capable unless they had well-armed Marines and Army soldiers and special force guys and whoever else standing there right next to them. And I think the same problem happened in Afghanistan, although I don't really have any experience there.
Yeah.
I've talked, many of my peers would say, yeah, these guys were as bold as you could get as long as we're right there with them. But as soon as we're not right there with them, are they getting it done? I think Iraq proved that they were not getting it done. We had a conversation about, hey, we're going to have to change our collateral damage ring. This was in 2015. And what that meant was we knew there was a chance for more innocent people to be hurt each time we dropped a bomb, in a certain area. The collateral damage ring had to expand from whatever the number it was to a new number of acceptable loss that comes as a result of dropping high-powered bombs in very tight-knit areas where you're trying to minimize collateral damage, but it's going to happen, right? You're fighting a war, so it's going to happen. And anybody who sits here and tries to tell you we're laser precise and nobody gets hurt on the side, that's garbage. And it is what it is. So I remember having the collateral damage discussion, and everybody's like, "Do we all agree?" And I'm like, "Hell yeah, whatever, go on, whatever, man." And then you rationalize it. Well, you shouldn't be there in the first place. Now, is that a fair rationalization? No, not at all. I'm not a person who lives on the ground in this neighborhood who's dirt poor and doesn't have the ability to get out of there and is unfortunately surrounded now by a bunch of terrorists who are being hunted by another organization, and I'm just an innocent bystander. I don't have any. I can't get my head into their head. But as a military guy, I don't even think twice about the emotional connection to them. In 2015, the unit that was attached to us had a fixed wing aviation element to it. And the fixed wing aviation element was conducting operations in select areas to fight ISIS. And I won't go into the details of where, but let's just say it was in a neighborhood along the Iraqi-Syrian border. And on a daily basis, there was an air tasking order where targets were being bombed and ISIS guys were being bombed in this area. And I knew for a fact that our aviation element was part of that. And I knew for a fact that we were developing targets ourselves and we were recommending targets. And I knew for a fact that everything that fell under our span of control, me as the operations officer and my commander, had something to do with the nature of the types of bombing that these guys were doing. We weren't the sole controllers, but we were absolutely affixed to this problem set as much as anybody else who was fighting ISIS during Inherent Resolve. Fast forward to 2018, I've got 3 or 4 kids going to German schools here in Germany. And my youngest daughter doesn't speak a lick of German. And there's a little girl in her class, and this is the story that I got. The little girl in her class felt badly for her and went home and told her mother, "Mom, there's an American girl in my class. She doesn't speak any German. Can you help me to understand some English so that I can communicate with her and help teach her so that she understands?" In and of itself, a little girl at the age of my daughter, who at that point I think was 5 or 6, to even think that way is, it reinstills your possible faith in something greater, right? Because you're like, what little girl is thinking that way? It's a bit of an emotional topic for me, but so the little girl's mother speaks very broken English, but helps find a way for her daughter to speak enough that she then goes to school and starts communicating with my daughter. And she helps my daughter begin to learn German so that my daughter can actually understand what's going on in the class. I come home from work one day, and there's a woman sitting in my living room talking to my wife. And it's the mom of that little girl who wanted to help. And as I listen to the conversation, I find out she's from Syria. And she'd been in Germany since 2015. And the neighborhood that she was from in Syria, the reason why she had come to Germany is because the neighborhood where she lived in Syria was getting bombed on a consistent basis every day. And that ISIS was within 10 kilometers and had infiltrated into the town that she came from. I know the town that she came from. It was on our target list. We were bombing the crap out of her town on a daily basis. And it was, that was hard. That was hard for me to know that I had something to do with this poor family having to leave their country and their home. And we talked about the desensitization, me thinking of anybody on the ground is just a rat that needs extermination. Not thinking about them as humans. And here's a family whose little girl is the most human thing I've ever met. trying to help out my daughter. That was rough. Excuse me, but that was rough. I struggled with that. I feel bad for that kid. I feel bad for the family. And I asked, and I couldn't tell her. I couldn't tell her. She's like, "You're in the military?" And I'm like, "Yes." And that was it. I was horrified. And could I have controlled what happened there? No. It wasn't up to me in the end. This is a decision that's at a higher level. But knowing that I was so immediately connected to that, that was ruthless.